Hey there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Nice to meet you, Ben.
And you?
Yeah, I'm Julia. Thanks for taking the time to talk for a couple minutes. The reason why I wanted to get in contact with you is I'm working on a doctoral dissertation on the Slovenian Reconciliationist movement. So I've been, hanging out with Jože Dežman, Mitja Ferenc, Anthony Mihalc, like that crew. And your book has been my favorite piece of writing on it out of anybody's.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, no, I'd be really, I'd be happy if I wrote something that turned out like this one day. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm from America. And I was really interested in the fact that this is self-published and that it contains a lot of different sources. And I just wanted to ask you about your experience of writing it and then how it was received and where you stand with it now. How did you get involved in this?
So what happened was I studied visual communications. I was at a place called the Royal College in London, Royal College of Art, and we all went to Slovenia to do this kind of cultural exchange thing. And a lot of the other people who I was there was a Slovene lady on the course, and she organised this. She was from Celje, and she organised this trip. And everyone kind of did their own projects, and I sort of researched the area and found out about this subject, and then just kind of fell into it, and that became my kind of main final. But it's basically a master's project, that book. So I spent about a year of it was a 2-year master's. I spent a year of it doing this book. So I kind of kept going to Slovenia and Croatia and researching it and meeting people. At the time I was kind of divided between whether I wanted to be an sort of investigative journalist, reporter type person, or a publisher, or something else. So this was kind of scratching that itch, really.
Yeah.
And I went on to kind of publish. It's self-published because at the time I'm very into kind of DIY culture, and sort of I didn't ever think about asking anybody else to publish it, really. Because I was already publishing my own magazines and things like that, it was just what I was doing rather than having a big thought process behind it.
Awesome. Okay. So do you have any Slovenian roots, or was this just you went to a different place, different country?
I have Belarusian and Ukrainian roots, and my ancestors sort of last century and 20th century came over to the UK and Argentina from there, and I think there were sort of similar issues going on in that part of the world. Of course it was going on everywhere, but I think I've always been very interested in the sort of some of them are kind of hardcore communists, Zionists, right wing. They kind of, during the civil war in Russia, they were sort of, some of them were white Russians and some of them were red Russians. Do you know what I mean? So I think I grew up with this kind of understanding that it's complicated, and then when I went there it resonated. So even though I don't have any blood links to it, I think I definitely have kind of that it resonated culturally. Do you know what I mean? But I think Absolutely. I was detached enough from it. I think because if I tried to do a similar thing about Belarus or Ukraine, it would be more emotive for me, so harder to be objective. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So you mentioned like being objective, and how did you start meeting people who would actually talk about this? Because I find sometimes people are very, very hesitant.
It was weirdly remarkably easy. Like Tomago Jelincic, do you know him?
No.
He's crazy nationalist guy. He was when the civil war broke out in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, Slovenia was in it for about 10 days, I think, and he was on the front line wearing women's clothes. I think, front line of the Slovene part of the Civil War. But he's completely crazy. But he's very well known. He was well known at the time. This is 12 years ago. But I just texted him or something, and he said, "Yeah, come around for tea." And that was kind of my experience with most of the people in the book. I think that people who were more, I spoke to the ex-head of the Secret Services and various other people, but I was either introduced by people who were close to them. Some of them were some of them were less candid and more worried about talking.
Yeah.
And then it was kind of a case of building up trust. But I would say that all of the officials who I spoke to, doctors, politicians, military people, and Secret Service people, they were pretty forthcoming at the time.
Okay. So this was 12 years ago. All right. So interesting time to be in Slovenia.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So you did this as your master's project. You were able to meet people and collect their stories. You have like quite a lot of, it seems like, archival material in here as well. So letters and like my favorite part is the amalgamation of like newspaper articles that a former partisan wanted to publish, and then he got death threats. And how about that? Where did you go for that kind of material?
That was a library in Celje.
Yeah.
So it was, I can't remember exactly, to be honest, until you mentioned it, I kind of forgot what happened, but it was a library in Celje, and there was, there's two things. There's the last chapter, which is called Heavenly Valley, and that was leaked to me. So that was kind of an anonymous source gave me that. And they were very kind of, they were very particular about me never sort of revealing who gave it to them, even though it probably doesn't matter now. Yeah. And then the content at the beginning, which is kind of, it's very sort of selective and heavily. I think I just threw myself into it. All of that is from a library in Celje. Okay. So they had a load of resources, and they just let me kind of go and ferret through them. I think this was before smartphones, so I probably had to photocopy things and stuff like that.
Wow. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are a bunch of photographs in there as well, like of the mass graves. Did you take all of those yourself? Were you going to visit them?
Yeah, it's all me.
Yeah.
All the photos are mine. There was a book, I think, by what's his name? I think Jose Desmond wrote a book. Yeah. Somebody wrote a book about it. So there were a few books that mentioned graves. There are some which are really well known. There are some that have fences around them and markings. There was a website at the time which was set up by, I think it was families of victims, and it was a really, really basic website. So literally just HTML, and it just had coordinates. So this is also before Google Maps, so we had to use kind of paper maps, and it's hard to believe now, but this was I had been speaking to somebody who was working on the Bosnian War, and there were roads. There were still roads at the time that weren't on maps, and we had all these kind of coordinates, and me and a friend of mine, we went over there a couple of times and just picked coordinates at random and went there to see what was there. And we would have to sort of ask farmers permission to go and look on their land and stuff like that. And we found a few of them that way. Wow. But there's a lot, and they're very kind of, some of them aren't marked at all, or they're just sort of local families know where they are. And then also people who go climbing, like potholers, they know about them. Absolutely. So in the sporting community, people who go into forests and go potholing, they know where they are. Yeah. I actually didn't use them as a resource at the time, but soon after the book came out, spoke to lots of people, climbers in Croatia and Slovenia who said, we know where they are because we go potholing.
Excellent. So it's really interesting to see how that happens, because the commission that I'm working with, it is a reconciliationist project, and they're really behind this as like a peace project, and they totally believe that this is what it will take for Slovenia to have a stable democracy and fully transition from communism, let go of those old grudges, etc. So was that the theme of things when you were doing this research?
No, it was more. It was being used more as a political football, for sure. Yeah. So there wasn't much talk about reconciliation, but I think it was still, that was the currency of it. So both, every political party would use it for their own ends. I definitely think that they both had their arguments, left and right had their arguments as to why either exhuming or not exhuming was a better thing to do in terms of reconciliation. Do you see what I mean? So one side would say, look, it's better to just leave these things in the past and let bygones be bygones, and blah, blah, blah. And the other side would say, well, we will only have peace if we exhume them, identify them, and get some closure on it, however you want to put it. And that's their way. So I think that both of them in their own ways were making an argument for reconciliation, but using different methods. Yeah. And they're both disingenuous. Do you know what I mean? They're both disingenuous. They're all kind of using it to either rub the other's nose in it in one way or another. And I think that when I was doing this, which may have changed now, there were people who were very much alive and remember it, whereas now it's become more theoretical. Yeah. These are people whose relatives were doing it rather than people who saw their mothers get killed or whatever. Yeah. And I think that as it becomes more kind of historical, the emotions are probably less real, and the politics of it are they're still there. Do you know what I mean? It's as you can see in Serbia and Kosovo and wherever else. It's they don't go away, but I think it just becomes less personal, maybe easier to do. Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm finding with a lot of people is that, like, if say the grandmother suffered this trauma, there was one woman I know who survived but barely, and some of her family wound up in one of these Brezni, one of the death pits, and she just couldn't talk about it, too traumatic. It wasn't recognized historically. And so her family, like all of her descendants, turned to Nazism. And so part of the people I've been following are these like random Nazi groups that are kind of using this history to, as you just said, to further their own ends. I think that's what really interested me about the whole thing in the first place, because basically the reason why I'm interested in this and similar topics is this whole sort of road to hell is paved with good intentions thing. Do you know what I mean? I think that especially in the modern world, people have lost sight that the problem is authoritarianism, and the problem isn't kind of left and right, it's authoritarian, and the reaction to that and the backlash to that. So all of these sort of horrific crimes being committed in the name of what was ostensibly a utopian project. Do you know what I mean? It's Yugoslav socialism was utopian. It wasn't. It's very easy to sort of look at Nazis and German, the Germans and what they did and all of that stuff, and see that there's not much utopianism. Well, there kind of was actually, but that's a controversial subject. There was, but I think that we now don't look back on that and see it with the same lens as we see communism and Yugoslav socialism. Yeah. So I think it was, especially because Tito was quite successful. There was a lot of peace and people really missed him. Yeah. And I think that to sort of see the sort of bloody foundations that was built on, people don't want to acknowledge it. That to achieve that, you had to kill everyone who disagreed with you, and that's an unpleasant reality. So you do actually give a voice to people who were perpetrators as well, and you go. For both sides, there's a lot of different viewpoints going on in here, a lot of controversial stuff. And there's also a couple of points where Americans and Brits are named specifically as those who should be held responsible. In the grander scheme of things, they caused the violence by sending all of these refugees back from Austria. How do you feel? Do you feel connected to that in any way? As a British person? Yeah. Honestly, I'm half Russian, half Scottish, and I think British people we used to control, a huge percentage of the world, and we were, on the winning side in two horrific world wars. So I think to look at instances like this, to look at them in an isolated way, it's awful, but then you look at it kind of through the broader in context of everything else that was going on. It's yes, mistakes were made, absolutely. Do I feel guilty as a British person? No, not at all. I'm glad we won the war, for sure. I think that if it hadn't been for Britain and America, the world would be a worse place. And that absolutely doesn't let Britain off the hook for things like, some of the colonialist atrocities that were perpetrated all over the world. I think it's just this sort of moral equivalence thing. I don't personally believe that German kids are responsible for that. I don't believe in national guilt. I think it's completely useless. I think people. Yes, okay. I also think that the people who perpetrated these crimes were part of a system, so it's hard to blame individuals as well. But all of it is, I think if you extract all of the blame from everything, it's what happened. It's just what happened, and you can kind of go and analyze it and make people feel bad about it. But I think that's why I wanted to give a voice to so many people in there, is that I doubt that there are not many people I've come across who had evil intent. Do you know what I mean? There were a few, but by and large, they were people, if you were fighting with the partisans and somebody told you to go and kill three prisoners of war, and you were scared for your own life, people would do it. I don't think that makes them evil. I think that makes them in a really shit situation. And that's by and large what happens in war. You have a handful of psychopaths, and you have an awful lot of foot soldiers doing things that they really don't want to be doing, and they probably normalize it and find ways of dealing with it, which is also unpleasant. What's the name of the guy, the guy in the cherry orchard, the old Secret Service head? So he was interesting because he absolutely was responsible for some very bad things. But it was interesting to meet him because he's a human being, and we sat in this cherry orchard with his dog and had a nice cup of tea, and I sort of knew what he had been involved in. And it sort of it humanized me, and it sort of made me think I don't believe in evil people. I believe in sort of sick people generally, and I think that some people are very, very unwell and very sick, and I think that all of the rest of it is it's complicated. And I think but what I really wanted to get across in this book is that it's nuanced and grey area, and there's no it's not easy to blame anybody, and it's not easy to sort of see why things happen sometimes, but they did, and then you sort of decide how to move on, which is what's happening now with Reconciliation.
Okay, so I do follow your Instagram and Ditto Press in general. And one thing I've noticed is it seems like you have an interest in exposing sometimes the ugly side, kind of like a morbid curiosity in, and to me that resonates like completely with the kind of project that you did with Grobišče. Are you doing anything else with Ditto Press right now that explores the same themes?
Kind of. I was a bit of a fork in the road at the time, and I thought, to be totally honest, that project was probably the thing I was proudest of, one of the things I'm proudest of that I've ever done, but also it was very serious, and I'm not a very serious person. So I think I have friends who are war crimes investigators, and friends who work for the military, and friends who do some very serious NGO work, and I think that I have a level of trollish detachment, which means that I can't be too serious about things. I think that I have to say that of all the people I know, lots of people share this. So I don't think you get involved. I can't speak for you, but I don't think that you get involved in looking into these things if you don't have some degree of morbid curiosity.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it's a level of sort of how honest do we want to be about it. And I think that for me, it became academic. Do you know what I mean? I have trouble being really, really serious about things for a prolonged period of time. So this was a serious project, and there's nothing in it that I regret. But I think that I'm doing a book at the moment with Counterfuture, who's on Instagram, about Ukrainian police corruption. And
that sounds awesome.
It's really good. Got access to these huge archives of stuff for one reason or another, and I love that kind of thing. I love kind of. Also, I work in fashion and music and with all of this stuff, but I love the sort of interplay of, knowing about all this very serious stuff and really having looked into it, but then bringing some of that knowledge into some very frivolous areas as well.
Totally. I would argue that, these personality traits also make you better equipped to look into this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it sort of depends what you want to get out of it. I think that if you can't understand why, it's a bit of the poacher turned gamekeeper type of thing. If you can't understand why people would ever do anything like that, then it makes you very bad at looking into it. If you see anybody committing a crime or anybody doing, committing an atrocity or behaving in an unstable way and think, I cannot possibly fathom that, it makes it hard to look into it, to a degree. So I think that having an element of insight. That's why I don't mean to be rude, but that's why a lot of psychoanalysts and batshit crazy.
Yeah,
because that's what leads them to do it. Do you know what I mean? That's what leads them to do it. Yeah,
I find that when I try to write about this stuff, I have to be in a very particular mindset that doesn't come super naturally to me. Come very naturally to me. And So if I'm planning to like get in and like write a chapter of the dissertation, I'll watch like 3 Holocaust movies in a row, and then it's some shit off live leak, just to kind of ground myself back in that mentality, because otherwise I find I'm pretty buoyant. But working with like the caving crew and people who did lose relatives in the Brezhny and the Foibe, it's interesting to see how they cope with it. And I remember at one point after I was in one of them for the first time, and I started having these like horrific nightmares. And so I called a member of the caving crew, and I said, what's going on? Like, how do you deal with this? Because you have relatives. This is not my trauma, but it was plaguing me for months. And he was just like, oh, this is pretty normal. You're just being haunted, which surprised me because he's like a devout Catholic. And I was like, oh, well, okay, that didn't help at all. So I called another member of the caving crew, said the same thing, and he was like, no, you're not being haunted. You're being mass haunted. And when I talked with a few more, in the end, they just said, like, here's what you got to do. You just have to have, like, an open conversation with the ghosts. And it's this kind of thing, like, that incident showed me that people deal with it in ways that don't necessarily even fit into their worldview. And there are just so many contradictions in the way that people live their lives around these graves, because they're everywhere. There's over 800 documented now. In this country is so tiny. So part of, what I'm trying to do is just get into people's experience of like living with sites of mass death. They have a couple of farmers who have 2 mass graves on their property. One has like 45 children in it. And a lot of people I find choose to deny that there's anything at all. And personally, like as researcher, I don't find that it's my place to say, like, no, I've been inside, I've seen the bones, this is a site of death. In those instances, I've chosen just to let people cope how they're coping. I don't know.
I think that's a really important point, that I'm glad you said about haunted and ghosts, because so for a couple of weeks when I was there on and off, I was sleeping in the forest in a Land Rover with a friend, and the sort of energy of those places and the haunting of it, I think, was a very important part of it for me. And it's not something that I wrote about in the book, but it absolutely was like being in a ghost story. And I'm not afraid of that. I don't personally think that, I think that Catholicism is a very kind of it's a very spooky religion in a lot of ways. I don't find it that surprising at all. I think that I'd be more surprised if you were working with sort of hardcore communist atheists who are talking about ghosts and spirits. But I think it's, I absolutely felt that energy. And then I don't know about you, but I got into this thing of thinking, like, is it all in my head? Do these places have meaning? Is there energy in places? Is there memory of deaths and mass deaths and mass murder? And I was like, well, it doesn't really matter whether it's constructed in my head or if it's kind of coming from that sort of philosophical question that doesn't really matter. But it was a very powerful thing. And I think, if you sort of extrapolate that to national psyche and like, what is that? You can pretend it's not there, but everyone knows they are. And actually, we're walking on dead people all the time. I live in London. There's huge plague pits. There's there's been there's been hangings and executions and murders and all of this stuff, but it doesn't have the same texture when it's been done kind of officially. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I think in places like, Ukraine and Czech Republic and, Kosovo, like places where there have been relatively recent mass murders and mass graves and that kind of thing, it has a different texture because of spookiness. It's like it's embedded in the forest. Do you know what I mean?
It's so weirdly connected to the landscape. There are all these different elements that do that, like the lipa trees, they have these trees that are the conduits between like the underworld and heaven. And so some people believe in those. Some people, really miss the presence of witness trees, with the town trees that used to like actually take part in municipal legislation, and they had to witness anything important that happened in a locality, like a wedding or a funeral. And the trees could make alliances and go against the will of the people if they wanted. It's like the landscape has such such a deeper meaning for people that they don't initially articulate, I find, but they come out in these smaller behaviors and just the way that people navigate the land and treat the graves and treat the pits in general, whether they have bones or not, if they're, completely unknown. It's just the way people are connected to the land that's, it keeps surprising me in ways that it comes out. There was, in old Slavic paganism, a lot of the Nazis that I work with identify as old Slavic pagans, and they maintain that these, since the 6th century Slavic settlement of the region, the pits were, since they lead directly to the underworld, to an underground river, or just empty into the abyss, they're people's means of sacrificing, giving small bits of food, animals, sometimes people, and that would appease the gods. It would keep everything stable and balanced. And so when I hear these arguments about why the pits were used in the Second World War, can't help but wonder if it's more than just geological convenience. Here's a hole, we need to get rid of these people, and we'll put them in. But there's something deeper.
Symbolic, yeah, definitely. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, because it's do those beliefs come from the geography, or does the geography, it becomes a cyclical thing.
Always, yeah, absolutely. This whole idea of reconciliationism, as you were just saying, it's going on everywhere. I think it's relevant to all places, but in particular, post-socialist countries. I'm really interested in the Polish argument about whether to let the physical remains of Auschwitz crumble because they are naturally decaying, or to rebuild it. And I do see that same argument being reflected here with the act of digging for the bones and bringing these things back. Where do you stand on that?
That's a very good parallel, because when I was there, I went to Auschwitz, and there was a visit from an Israeli military unit, and they kind of did a parade around the place, and I was kind of standing there watching it. I was thinking, it's in their, I'm not getting into a kind of anti-pro-Israel whatever thing, but it's very much in their interests for that to be there as a physical structure to fly their troops out to reinforce their kind of belief in the state of Israel as a response to what happened in Europe, for right or for wrong, whatever you think about that. And it's well, if that disappears, I don't know, I think that, do you preserve that stuff? I don't know.
That's an interesting experience.
I'd be surprised if they let it completely crumble. I'm sure they'll preserve it in some way, but it's why are they? The thing is, it's as all of these things become shrines for both sides. So you know that Nazis visit Auschwitz as a shrine, and that the Israeli army do, and they both do it for the same reason, really. So I don't know. Maybe it's better to just destroy everything and leave nothing. That's why why they chucked Bin Laden's body out of a boat, so that it doesn't become something where he can be easily martyred and visited and turned into a shrine. So
that is such an interesting experience. And with the whole the Auschwitz thing, what does it mean to be rebuilding it if we're actually literally reconstructing it? I see the same thing happening here with the Reconciliationist movement, and they are so firmly righteous about what they're doing, and convinced that all humans deserve proper burial. But with this whole the theme of the road to hell is paved with good intentions, they're actually really doing some damage to Roma communities, because Zupancic, the mayor of Ljubljana, won't allow for Roma remains to be buried in Žale Cemetery. So the commission, they have no funding to bury anywhere else. They're digging up the Roma bodies, and then they just sit in these ossuaries for now 8-10 years. They just found a couple graves last year and dug up 40 more Roma people. And you don't hear a lot from the Roma about this, but I do know that in their cosmology, you don't disturb the dead. You don't even talk about them, really. So you don't name them in conversation. Maybe you come up with a different way to refer to people, but you let them rest. And so the commission, in this kind of Western democracy mission to give everyone proper burial, it is super well intended, I think, but it's making a new trauma for the Roma. which is just absolutely depressing to witness right now.
Yeah, I mean, they get a bad deal wherever they go. To be honest, they very often are the bottom of people's considerations, for sure.
Yeah. Can you revisit like the haunting thing for a moment and just tell me a little more about your experience of that?
So I think I just got very drawn into the experience of it. So the experience of, say, staying in a forest, sleeping in a truck, effectively, knowing there were bears around, and I don't know, I can't remember if there's wolves or not, but just kind of being in this big, dark, quiet forest, knowing what had happened, reading the stories, and then kind of reenacting them, and just feeling like I just felt like there were, I felt like there was an energy. And I think that what happened for me before I visited a mass grave is I'd sort of go and walk through these forests and be reading about what had gone on, and I would kind of see it everywhere. Do you know what I mean? So I would see some fox bone and think it was, is that a human bone or whatever, and it becomes quite childlike. For me, it's sort of like, it's like playing out fantasy. So there's the fantasy of it, like, am I just playing a game? Am I just kind of like a kid in a forest making up monsters and whatever? Well, yeah, kind of, but also there's a reality to it. So, really monstrous things happened. But I don't know if that kind of haunted energy is entirely fantastical, or if it doesn't really matter. Do you know what I mean? I think that it's all, they're all human constructs. But it was a very powerful thing. And I kind of went away from it after a year of working on it, just kind of not sick of it, but I've definitely had enough of being around, death. And it was weird as well, because it was slightly longer ago. Like, I wasn't, not looking into the crimes of the 90s, looking into the crimes of the late 40s. It felt like it was so long ago that it shouldn't matter anymore, but it wasn't that long. Do you know what I mean? It was sort of 60 years before. But I sort of felt like I didn't have the right anymore for it to feel like a current thing, because they hadn't been killed in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. I'm in the city of London now. I'm in Clerkenwell, and I'm absolutely sure that I'm on top of bodies as we speak. It's one of the world's great cities. There's graveyards everywhere, and I think that sort of holding a bone, I don't know how sort of exposed you've been to this stuff, but seeing or holding bones that are kind of, if it's at 500 years old, it feels very different to if it's somebody who was killed very recently. It's like energetically feels very different. And this was just sort of long enough ago that it was a bit tenuous, And there were horse skeletons in there. I don't know if you've seen any of those, but have you seen horse skeletons in graves?
No, I haven't.
So one that I went to, there's a story that sometimes they used to basically make people lie down and trample them to death with horses, then throw the horse into the grave afterwards. And I'd read this before. I went down into this particular grave, and there were a lot of human remains and a horse's remains, so it kind of backed up the story. And I found that in a way kind of more haunting than just human skulls. Do you see what I mean? I think sort of seeing a sort of document of how it all happened was really disturbing. That was kind of more haunting, not because I'm not sort of placing animal life above human life, but just it sort of made it more real for some reason. Yeah,
absolutely. They go to so much trouble making new memorials and trying to make sure every memorial is perfect, but I'm starting to think that maybe the best way to remember is just get people to have this kind of experience, because it never leaves you. I look at memorials every day, and I don't think those are as effective in commemorating.
No, but then the thing is, who do you... I guess the problem in that part of the world is that you would get one side very easily to go and visit them, and the other side just wouldn't do it. And they're probably the people who would benefit more from it. So,
also true.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
That's the issue. Have you looked into the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee?
Just on a very shallow level.
That's really worth looking at. It's very interesting. On many levels. So if you can, I think that's and Northern Ireland as well. But those are really interesting. How they've handled them, sort of sometimes successfully and sometimes not. But they were good.
Okay, all right. So now you're working on a project in Ukraine. There does seem to be a theme with your work. Can you comment on that?
My work. I'm just drawn to things that interest me. So I've published books on, just having a think. I mean, I've published books on black metal in Iceland, skinhead culture, necrophilia, mass graves, various different types of music. I think that all of the projects that I'm closest to are talking about difficult or controversial things.
Yeah.
I have to say that, I find the history of Europe very interesting. I find especially Northern and Eastern Europe absolutely fascinating. I'm not so interested in sort of Mediterranean, like French history, Italian history, but I think that all of Eastern Europe and up to Northern Europe I find endless, and Russia I find fascinating. So the themes, a lot of my work has got nothing to do with history really, but it's always, the other thing is it's all beauty. So there's beauty in all of it, and I think that that's one, if we go back to the sort of spooky enchantment, haunting type of thing, I think there's something beautiful about that as well. So going to a forest, a beautiful forest with these carvings in the trees to mark mass graves and knowing what's happened there, I think it's sort of highly disturbing and highly haunting, but also highly beautiful. I think that that's something that ties... It's something that not a lot of people find interesting or understand, but I find the sort of extremities of human behaviour really fascinating.
Okay.
And if you tie that in with beauty as well, it's I don't really ever work on anything or look at anything that's just ugly. There's always an element of that interplay there.
Okay, so to you, it's the extremities of human behaviour that you're finding beauty in.
Yes, and I'd say I use the word beauty in a very sort of specific way.
Yeah.
I don't mean sort of visual aesthetics. I mean, it's the whole. Yeah, it's hard to sort of put into words. But I think that book sort of encapsulates it for me at the time. And also sort of recently, because I work a lot more commercially now, I stay away from more difficult subjects because they don't resonate with big audiences so much. It's very hard. I found out recently it's very hard to do that. To sort of resonate very, very difficult subjects with very big audiences. Some people can do it successfully, but I am still learning how. The audience for this is tiny, really. It's like 1,000 people.
Can I ask what that experience was, trying to get people interested in like a big audience?
I worked with a pop band, and we commissioned a film that was quite confrontational, and a lot of their fans absolutely hated it. Just hated it. In my mind, it was a very beautiful thing, and it was a really sort of interesting piece. And I was like, I'm kind of forgetting how broad the general public is. Do you know what I mean? And how it's not, if people don't like something or understand something or relate to it, it's not a problem for them. It's a problem for me. Do you know what I mean? And I think that people, especially in Hollywood, people do cross that bridge successfully, but I think it's hard to do. So you can't please everyone. With something like this, it's got such a specific audience that it's almost impossible that someone who's not already very interested in it will come across it. Do you know what I mean? Whereas if you do a music video for a big pop group, you are definitely going to put it in front of people who won't like it, whatever you do.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. One thing I do like about your book is that, there are pictures of the graves, there's a few pictures of bones, but really it's more pictures of people. And I kind of love that because so many times when people and writers and academics especially try to get into this stuff and get people interested, they go for kind of the pornographic imagery with showing the bones and the horror and the slaughter. And you seem to come at it from a very human angle, and I like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the whole. I think that was the whole point of the book, is to humanize the whole situation. Really, that's it. It's just humanizing the situation, and by humanizing, I mean that humans are fallible and complicated and difficult and unpredictable and mysterious and weird and all of it. That's what humans are. Yeah. I think that's kind of the antithesis of. It's also, I don't want to get political here, but it's also sort of the antithesis of the communist project, which I think was to kind of, is to reduce human beings into sort of something quite programmable and predictable. I think that's what doesn't resonate with me about that ideology, and I think it's what's led to a lot of very, very significant atrocities that people aren't comfortable to look at. We're not comfortable to look at what's happened in Russia or what happened in China at all.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. One of the things I do like about working on this kind of a project, but find to be very difficult in like on a practical / financial level is the fact that in academia, especially in anthropology, I'm sure you're familiar with the colonial history of this discipline, you get a choice in my program to go wherever in the world you want, do whatever project you want, and they'll fund you to do this, but it is much more difficult to get grants and positions, like any kind of work, if you're working in Europe, because there's still this thought of like, well, if we're looking at human brutality and human origins, you're not going to find that here, it's too civilized. And so studying modern day Europe is one hell of a problem when it comes to trying to get external funding. But there is something, I know, there's just something that feels vindicating about kind of finding this in spite of that belief that there were the two wars and that was it.
I mean, this is I think it's one of the things that really got me motivated with this was, my mind's gone blank. What's the name of the biggest mass grave from the Balkans War? Srebrenica. Yeah. So I was reading about that and reading people saying this is the worst war crime since World War II. And I was like, it's not the worst war crime since World War II. It's the worst war crimes since, sometime after World War II, because war crimes were happening after the war finished, and people just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about what happened in Czechoslovakia, to fleeing Germans because they were Nazis and they deserved it. Yeah. And they don't want to talk about what happened in Yugoslavia because it's been suppressed and only about 3 people care outside of the Balkans. Do you know what I mean? And did you ever read Nikolai Tolstoy's book, The Minister and the Massacres?
No. Let me write that down.
So that's a very interesting book. Nikolai Tolstoy is a controversial British sort of aristocratic figure, and that book's illegal because it slanders some ministers at the time, because it's talking about Yalta and it's talking about the sort of refugee situation, and it's quite a conspiracy theory type book. Mm-hmm. I mean that in a sort of history conspiracy type way, but it's worth reading. Okay. Nobody, he was basically pinning the blame for what happened in Yugoslavia, what we're talking about, on a certain, I think it was a Conservative minister, and it went through a big trial in the UK. But wow. It's almost impossible to find people who care about this stuff, and it's for me, I find it absolutely baffling. Yeah, and like you say, people saying like, what's the point studying anthropology in Europe? Like there was do you know The Onion, that satirical newspaper? Yeah, I do. There was a hilarious one years ago it was like Europeans being smug to Americans. It was like, no genocide here for over 15 years. Like, yeah, we've had genocide here in the fucking last 20 years. It was happening in the 90s, like serious genocide, like very, very brutal wars. And for some reason, I think we're very good in Europe at cleaning up after ourselves. So really awful things happen and we make it look nice quite quickly. Do you know what I mean? Whereas some other bits of the world, those scars remain visible for longer, I think.
Interesting. Huh. Okay. And it's just fascinating to me to think about how you got into this project. You just showed up in the place and then this caught your attention and you ran with it. My history with that was like a personal connection. I met a survivor who just started kind of reliving her trauma. She was right at the end of her life. Was it also a human connection for you, or was it like you seeing the graves around?
No, somebody took me to it wasn't a reconciliation meeting, it was an anniversary meeting. It was like an anniversary ceremony at one of the memorials. Okay. So for some reason, I can't remember why, that was how I really got into it. Where did you meet yours?
I was working, like 6 years ago, I was working in Milan as a translator, and this woman had grown up in Idria, in modern-day Slovenia, Italy at the time, and she had never told anyone like what happened to her family, what happened to her, and so I don't know why she chose me to tell the story, but I think it might have to do with the fact that I could transcribe it in English. She did not want to have it written in either Slovenian or Italian. And the first thing she knew about me was that I was like a temporary it was a temporary job placement, so I was staying only for 2 years. So there's kind of an end in sight to what could be like a painful relationship. And yeah, it was a fascinating experience kind of watching her try to tell the story, but it had settled in her mind in such a way that, you know, like a lot of trauma, it didn't come out in a linear manner. It was like she'd get into that mindset, and then she'd have like a burst, like some awful flashback, and, you know, we'd write it down, put it on the wall, and then we'd be trying to piece together the chronology of everything. And then when she finally, I guess, got a flashback, and she just said, "That's it. Like, that's the whole story. Everything's been told. I'm done." And then she died like 2 days later.
It's all just kind of, I don't know if you know much about Northern Ireland, but the whole I had a Protestant girlfriend for years, but they literally think they're other animals. You know, they think Protestants think that Catholics are not subhuman. It's so entrenched in them by their respective ideologies and whoever's kind of seeking to control them. I think it's, you know, whether it's Israel, Palestine, or, you know, what we're talking about, or Northern Ireland, is, you know, when it's very easy to be on one side and look at the other side and say, you know, that's crazy and disgusting and awful, but then sort of I guess what we're saying, to be in it and listen to everyone and understand how you get to be in that position and then challenge it in a human way is, I think, the best sort of counter to authoritarianism and, you know, bigotry and all of that stuff, rather than just saying, "Oh, well, that's wrong." You know, it's not so helpful.
All right, that's a really great articulation of the kind of work you do. Actually, I think that was
not everyone gets it, sadly, but we'll see.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, Ben, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Cool.
Good to meet you. Take care. Bye.
See ya.